There is a moment in the narcissist's psychological journey that occurs so rarely that most never experience it. A moment when something genuine finally emerges through decades of carefully disguised emptiness. It's not intellectual insight into their own dynamics. It's not a sophisticated performance of vulnerability. It's real, visceral, terrifying feeling. For the first time since childhood, perhaps for the first time in adulthood, the narcissist touches an authentic emotional capacity within themselves. And at the exact moment this happens, in the fragile instant when something true finally breathes within the dead psychic structure, they perceive with devastating clarity that another person will destroy it. Not accidentally, deliberately. And this person is not a cruel rival or a vengeful enemy. It's an empath. The one who should understand transformation, who should recognize the miracle of something genuine emerging from so much emptiness. But the empath, operating from their own unintegrated shadow, from unhealed wounds, from rigid judgment disguised as discernment, will not see the fragile emergence of true love. They will only see yet another sophisticated manipulation. And by destroying it, you will ensure that the narcissist never risks being genuine again. The story involves three intertwined lives in a configuration that will defy all expectations about narcissistic empathic dynamics. First is Ricardo Fonseca, 62 years old, a construction magnate whose fortune was built on his ability to read people and strategically exploit their vulnerabilities. He married 3 times, always to women who admired his power, and divorced when they began demanding an emotional presence he couldn't provide. He had 4 children who see him as a generous financial provider, but an emotionally absent father. For 40 years, Ricardo operated behind such a well-calibrated persona that even he forgot it was a mask. His psychological makeup is what I call elevated pragmatic narcissism. He had no grandiose illusions about being cosmically special. He knew he was empty at his core. But he had built an efficient system where emptiness didn't matter. He provided resources, others provided admiration and services. It was a clean transaction. He didn't pretend to feel love for wives or children. He simply fulfilled contractual relationship obligations, and that had been enough for decades. At 60, Ricardo began experiencing something he initially interpreted as a medical problem. A strange sensation in his chest that wasn't exactly pain, but persistent discomfort. He consulted a cardiologist who found nothing wrong. A gastroenterologist also ruled out any problems. It was his family doctor who eventually suggested it might be anxiety or stress and recommended that Ricardo consider talking to someone. Ricardo initially rejected the suggestion. He didn't need therapy. He didn't have emotional problems because he didn't have emotions to be problematic. But the sensation in his chest persisted. And because Ricardo was a man who solved problems efficiently, he eventually agreed to consult a psychologist, not for therapeutic work, but for a technical diagnosis of what was causing the physical symptom. The psychologist he found was Dr. Enrique Mora, a 58-year-old man with decades of experience. During the first session, Ricardo described his symptoms clinically. Enrique listened and then asked a seemingly unrelated question. When was the last time you allowed yourself to genuinely feel something? Ricardo was confused by the question. He felt things. Irritation when deals didn't go as planned. Satisfaction when he closed a lucrative agreement. Enrique nodded gently. I'm not talking about reactions to external stimuli. I'm talking about emotion that arises from within, not as a response to something outside, but as one's own internal experience. Ricardo honestly considered the question and realized he couldn't recall such an experience in adulthood, perhaps as a child, before learning that emotions were manipulated by his mother or ignored by his father. But since then, nothing. Enrique explained that the sensation in his chest could be Ricardo's body trying to communicate that something was emerging emotionally after decades of suppression. Ricardo dismissed the interpretation as pop psychology lacking substance. But the feeling persisted, and because he was a man accustomed to solving problems, he decided to conduct an experiment. He would continue sessions for a defined period to see if there was any merit in Henrique's theory. Not because he believed in it, but because he would systematically eliminate possibilities. For the next few months, something unexpected began to happen. In the weekly sessions, Ricardo began to access childhood memories that he had completely buried. Not through dramatic techniques, but simply through Henrique asking questions and patiently waiting for answers. Ricardo remembered being 7 years old and crying because the family dog died. His mother said that men don't cry over animals. His father completely ignored it. Ricardo remembered being 9 and excited about a science project. He presented it to his parents, who barely glanced at it before returning to their discussion. Ricardo remembered being 12 and falling in love for the first time, confessing to his mother that he was constantly thinking about a girl. His mother laughed and said it was childish nonsense. Each memory was a moment where genuine emotion had been expressed and then invalidated, ridiculed or ignored. And Ricardo, the intelligent child that he was, had learned his lesson. Genuine emotions were vulnerabilities that others used against you or simply didn't matter. So he had turned them off. Systematically, completely. He built a persona that didn't need emotional validation because it had no emotions to validate. Henrique didn't judge this adaptation. He observed that it made perfect sense given the environment in which Ricardo grew up. Children do what they need to do to survive psychologically. But Henrique gently suggested that perhaps now, at 60, with established financial security and no dependence on parental figures, Ricardo could consider whether he still needed the defenses he built at age 12. Something about that observation resonated with him. Ricardo began to notice that the sensation in his chest intensified when he suppressed emotional impulses. When his young grandson visited, Ricardo felt the urge to hug him, but suppressed it because it wasn't his usual behavior. When his daughter shared her professional achievements, Ricardo felt something that could be pride, but pushed him down before he could fully identify it. When he saw a particularly beautiful sunset, and for a second wanted only to experience the beauty without evaluating its usefulness. Gradually, with Henrique's careful encouragement, Ricardo began to allow himself small moments of genuine emotional experience. Not dramatically, just noticing when something arose internally and not immediately suppressing it. And in those moments, the sensation in his chest changed. It didn't disappear, but it transformed into something that wasn't exactly discomfort. It was more like awakening a part of the body that had been dormant for decades, an uncomfortable tingling of circulation returning. One day, 18 months after starting therapy, Ricardo was in a cafe waiting for a business meeting when he saw a woman at the next table. She was in her 50s. With grey hair she didn't try to hide, eyes that seemed to hold profound knowledge acquired through experience. She was reading a book, completely absorbed, occasionally smiling at something on the page. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about her externally, but Ricardo felt something he had never felt in his adult life. It wasn't simply sexual attraction, it was a deep desire to know her inner self, to understand what made her smile at words on the page, to sit in her presence and simply exist without an agenda. The feeling terrified him. Ricardo stood up to leave, to escape the discomfort, but then the woman looked up, made brief eye contact and smiled. She didn't smile because she recognized him or wanted something. She simply smiled as a simple human acknowledgement of another human being. And something in Ricardo broke, not dramatically, not visibly, but internally his fundamental defenses cracked. Ricardo didn't approach any woman that day, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. Not obsessively like a narcissist would think about a conquest target, but with a genuine curiosity that was completely new to him. He wanted to know who she was, not what she could do for him, just who she was as a person. In the following session with Enrique, Ricardo attempted to describe the experience. Enrique listened attentively to what Ricardo had learned to appreciate. When Ricardo finished, Enrique said something that stuck with him. "What you are describing sounds like the first stages of the capacity to love genuinely, not loving as a transaction or possession, but loving as a deep interest in another being, as an end in itself, not a means to one's own purposes." Ricardo initially rejected the interpretation. He didn't know how to love. He had never loved. But Enrique gently pointed out that just because he had never developed the capacity didn't mean it didn't exist within him. It was simply dormant, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. Ricardo became secretly obsessed with finding the woman from the cafe again, not necessarily to approach her, but simply to see if the feeling had been a momentary aberration or something more significant. It took 3 weeks of regular visits to the same cafe before he saw her again. When he saw her, the same feeling returned, stronger this time, as if recognizing her activated something deep within his psychic structure. This time, Ricardo allowed himself to get closer. He asked if a seat at her table was available. The cafe was crowded, so the question was reasonable. She said it was free. They sat in silence for a few minutes, each reading. And then, naturally, conversation began. She asked about the book he was carrying. He asked about hers. Conversation flowed with an ease Ricardo had never experienced. There was no agenda. There was no performance. Just genuine exchange. Her name was Ana Costa. She was 54 years old, a retired literature teacher after 30 years teaching in public school. She had lost her husband to cancer 3 years earlier. She had 2 adult children living in other cities. Her life was simple now. Reading, walks, volunteering at the local library. She spoke of all this with the quiet acceptance of someone who had made peace with loss and found contentment in simplicity. Ricardo found himself sharing things he never shared before, not about business or achievements, but about the feeling of having lived 62 years without truly experiencing most of them. About being in therapy for the first time and discovering that perhaps he had shut down parts of himself decades ago. Ana listened without judgment. She didn't try to fix or advise. She simply received what he offered. They began meeting regularly at that cafe, always without formal plans. They would simply show up at similar times, and if they both happened to be there, they would talk. Ricardo noticed that Anna's presence had an effect on him that nothing else did. Around her, he felt no need to perform. He could simply exist, and this permission to simply exist without a mask was a gift he didn't know he needed. After 3 months of casual encounters, Ricardo invited Ana to dinner. She hesitated. Ricardo saw her hesitation, and for the first time in his life, didn't interpret it as rejection to be overcome through persuasion, but as a boundary to be respected. He said he completely understood if she wasn't interested. He didn't pressure her. And this lack of pressure, this genuine respect for her agency, made Ana reconsider. She accepted. Dinner was a revelation for Ricardo. Ana spoke about her marriage to her husband. They had met young, grown up together, and navigated the challenges of raising children with limited resources. There was no romanticization. She spoke honestly about difficulties as well, moments when they felt distant, conflicts they had to work through. But through it all, there was a deep commitment to each other. And when he died, Ana said, it was like losing a part of herself. But a part she was grateful to have had, even though having it and losing it hurt deeply. Ricardo listened with something he could only describe as longing. Longing for the kind of connection Ana described. He had never experienced anything remotely similar. His marriages had been efficient transactions that ended when they no longer worked. He asked Ana how one learned to love in that way. Ana gently replied that it wasn't about learning technique. It was about allowing oneself to be vulnerable. about choosing another person repeatedly, even when it was difficult, about seeing another completely and being seen completely in return, vulnerability. The word Ricardo had spent his life avoiding. But sitting there with Anna, he felt for the first time that perhaps vulnerability wasn't a weakness to be avoided, but a gateway to something he had lost. In the following months, something extraordinary happened in Ricardo's psychic structure. In Jungian terms, an aspect of the self that had been completely dissociated began to emerge. Genuine emotional capacity that he had cut off at age 12 was trying to be reborn at age 62. And Anna, without trying, was providing an environment where this emergence was possible. Not because she did anything specific, but because her presence was so genuinely unagendered that it allowed Ricardo to experience connection without fear of exploitation. Ricardo began to feel things he didn't have the vocabulary to describe. When he was with Anna, something in his chest, no longer discomfort, but warmth, expanded. When he thought of her during the day, he felt an impulse not to control or possess, but to protect and nurture. When she shared her sadness about missing her husband, he felt an empathic pain that was completely new. He wasn't performing empathy. He was genuinely feeling her pain as if it were his own. In a session with Henrique, Ricardo tried to articulate what he was experiencing. Henrique listened, and then said something profound. "Ricardo, what you're describing is love. Not a performative version, not possession or transaction, but genuine love where you deeply care about another person's well-being regardless of what they do for you." Ricardo felt terror and wonder simultaneously. Genuine love meant total vulnerability. It meant that Anna had the power to hurt him in ways no one ever had, because for the first time, he genuinely cared about someone other than himself. But it also meant that, for the first time in 6 decades, he was truly alive. Ricardo decided to be honest with Anna about what he was feeling, not as a dramatic romantic declaration, but as a vulnerable sharing of inner truth. He said he had been in therapy for 2 years, working to access emotions he had suppressed since childhood, that her presence had catalyzed the emergence of emotional capacities he didn't know still existed within him, that he was falling in love with her in ways he didn't fully understand, but that were more real than anything he had felt before. Ina listened with an expression that Ricardo couldn't read completely. When he finished, she remained silent for a long time. Then she said something that was honest but complex. "Ricardo," she said, "I see change in you. I see that you're doing real work. And I care about you deeply, but I need to tell you something difficult. I have a friend whom you hurt deeply 15 years ago." Ricardo felt the world stop. "Who?" he asked. "Camilla Brando," Anna said. "She was his second wife. We were childhood friends. We lost touch when she married you. We reconnected after the divorce. And Ricardo, what she went through with you destroyed her. It took her years to rebuild her sense of self." Ricardo remembered Camilla. Their marriage had lasted 4 years. It ended when she said she could no longer live with an emotionally absent man. For Ricardo at the time, it had simply been incompatibility, a transactional relationship that stopped working. But listening to Anna describe it, he began to understand that for Camilla it had been much more. She had genuinely fallen in love. She had tried to reach him emotionally, and each time he didn't respond, each time he treated her intimacy as an irritation or manipulation, it had eroded her sense of self-worth until she was broken. Anna continued, "Camilla told me everything. How you were charming at first, but how that charm was calculated. How you were never truly emotionally present. How every attempt she made to connect was met with indifference or irritation. How she eventually began to question her own sanity because you denied things she had said, rewrote stories to make her seem irrational. When she finally left, she was in pieces." Ricardo felt something completely new, genuine shame, not embarrassment at having been caught, but true shame for the harm he had caused. He had never thought of ex-wives as people with deep inner lives that he had impacted. They were transactions that had ended, but listening to Anna describe Camilla's experience, he confronted for the first time that his actions had real emotional consequences for others. "I didn't know," he said. "It's not an excuse, but it's true. I was completely disconnected from any ability to see or feel an impact on others." Anna nodded. "I believe you didn't know in the sense of allowing yourself to fully recognize it. But Ricardo, Camilla knows we're spending time together, and she's deeply worried about me." Ricardo felt a chill run through him. "What did she say?" Anna took a deep breath. "She said that you're doing exactly what you did to her, that you're performing vulnerability and transformation to seduce me, that you're a narcissist who learned to imitate emotional intimacy but can't truly feel it, that eventually I'll see the emptiness beneath the performance, and when I do, it will be devastating because I will have invested believing it was real." Ricardo felt his heart, which he had only recently begun to feel, break, because he understood exactly why Camilla would say that. Based on her experience with him 15 years ago, her conclusion made perfect sense. He had been exactly what she described: empty, performing intimacy, and there was no reason for her to believe he had fundamentally changed. "But I've changed," Ricardo said, knowing even as he spoke that there was no way to prove it. 2 years of therapy. Confronting the emptiness I've carried for decades, learning to feel again, all real, all genuine. And what I feel for you is more real than anything I've ever experienced. But how do I prove that to someone who witnessed a version of me that was incapable of feeling? Anna looked at him with compassion, but also with something else: uncertainty, doubt. "Ricardo," she said gently, "I want to believe you. I see evidence of change, but Camilla is my childhood friend. She's begging me to stay away before you hurt me like you hurt her. And honestly, I don't know if what I'm seeing in you is genuine transformation or just a sophisticated performance." This was the turning point. The moment when Ricardo realized with devastating clarity that his empath, Anna, the person who had catalyzed the emergence of genuine emotional capacity in him, was going to destroy the only possibility of true love he had ever experienced. Not out of malice, not out of revenge, but out of justified loyalty to the friend he had destroyed when he was a different man, and because there was no way to externally distinguish between Ricardo genuinely transformed and Ricardo performing a more sophisticated act. In psychological terms, what was happening was a clash between two equally valid imperatives. Anna had a responsibility to herself and to Camilla to protect herself from potential narcissists. Camilla had every reason to believe that Ricardo was incapable of genuine change based on her experience. And Ricardo, finally having reached genuine emotional capacity after 6 decades of emptiness, was facing the annihilation of this fragile capacity, not because of his present failings, but because of his past actions. The tragedy was that everyone was operating from valid perspectives. Anna wasn't being unfair in doubting. Camilla wasn't being vindictive in warning. And Ricardo wasn't performing when he said he had changed. But the psychological truth of his transformation was externally indistinguishable from a sophisticated performance of transformation. And without a way to prove the difference, the outcome was predetermined. Richard tried everything he could think of. He offered to have a session with Henry, where Henry would confirm the work they had done. Anna gently pointed out that a therapist would say the client did the work, even if the client was simply performing for the therapist. Richard offered time, years if necessary, to prove consistency. Anna said that narcissists could maintain performances for years if the stakes were high enough. Every offer Ricardo made, every attempt to prove his authenticity, sounded exactly like what a narcissist performing authenticity would say, and Ricardo saw an impossible dilemma. If he gave up easily, he would confirm that he wasn't genuine. If he persisted too long, he would confirm that he was a manipulator incapable of respecting boundaries. There was no right move. Camilla eventually asked to meet Ricardo in person. Anna was present. Camilla looked at Ricardo with complex emotion. There was old anger there, but also sadness. "Ricardo," she said, "I spent years in therapy processing what you did to me. You made me question reality. You made me feel crazy. You made me feel like I was the problem when you simply couldn't or wouldn't connect emotionally." Ricardo listened without defending himself. He acknowledged everything. "Yes," he said, "everything you're saying is true. I did those things. I was incapable of genuine emotional connection. I manipulated without being aware of manipulating because I didn't see you as a person with an inner reality as real as my own. I was empty and treated you as an object to temporarily fill that void. And when that didn't work, I discarded you without understanding the harm I was causing." Camilla hadn't expected complete recognition without defensiveness. She expected denial or gaslighting, but Ricardo persisted. "I have no excuse," he said, "only an explanation. I had shut down my emotional capacity as a child because expressing emotion was punished or ignored. I built my entire life without access to genuine feelings. And only at 60 in therapy did I begin to reconnect with the capacity to feel." Anna catalyzed the emergence of this. "And for the first time in my adult life, I know what it is to love genuinely. Not to love as a transaction, but to love as to care deeply for another being." Camilla listened with a conflicted expression. Part of her wanted to believe, but a larger part, the part that carried scars from years with him, couldn't allow herself to believe. "Ricardo," she said finally, "I don't doubt that you believe you've changed. Narcissists often believe their own narratives, but I can't risk my oldest friend based on the possibility that this time it's different." And Anna, looking between Ricardo and Camilla, made her decision. "Ricardo," she said with a gentleness that made things worse, "I need to distance myself, not because I don't care about you, but because I can't distinguish between genuine transformation and sophisticated performance, and the risk of being wrong is too high." Ricardo felt something die inside him, not a persona, not a mask, but a genuine self that had begun to emerge. It was like watching a fragile plant finally sprout through arid soil, only to be trampled before it could properly take root. He understood Anna's decision. He even agreed with it rationally, but emotionally, it was the annihilation of the only real thing he had ever experienced. He didn't beg. He didn't try to manipulate. He simply said, "I understand, and I hope you'll be happy." And then he left, knowing he'd probably never see her again. In the following weeks, Ricardo went through something I can only describe as mourning for an unborn self. He had touched the capacity to love genuinely. He had experienced what it was like to feel a real connection with another being. And now he was being forced to confront that he might never have the opportunity to fully develop those capacities because actions of his previous self made it impossible for anyone to trust that transformation was genuine. In sessions with Henrique, Ricardo processed not only the loss of Anna, but a deeper self-awareness. He had lived 62 years as an empty man. He had hurt people who tried to love him because he was incapable of emotional reciprocity. And now, when he had finally developed the capacity for reciprocity, the legacy of who he had been made it impossible to use that capacity. It was punishment perfectly proportionate to the crime. He had made others feel unseen, unloved, disposable. Now he experienced the same invisibility, the same discardability, the same disbelief even when being genuine. Henry offered no easy consolation. He simply witnessed Ricardo's pain and gently suggested that perhaps Ricardo's job now wasn't to convince Anna or anyone else that he had changed. It was to live with the emotional capacity he had developed, to use that capacity to make amends where possible, and to accept that some consequences of decades of emotional emptiness were irreversible. Ricardo tried to make amends. He contacted Camilla and asked permission to speak without Anna present. Camilla hesitantly agreed. Ricardo didn't try to persuade her of anything. He simply offered full acknowledgement and apology for the harm he had caused. Not an apology expecting forgiveness. An apology recognizing the real and devastating impact on her life, and acknowledging that he bore responsibility for it. Camilla received an apology, but did not offer forgiveness. She said she would need time to process whether she believed it was genuine, and even if it was, forgiveness wasn't something she felt ready to offer. Ricardo accepted this. He understood that an apology didn't buy absolution. It was merely an acknowledgement of the truth. He also contacted his first and third ex-wives. He offered the same apologies without expectations. His first wife was confused, but politely accepted. His third wife was cynical, assuming it was a new manipulation for some purpose she didn't yet understand. Ricardo didn't try to convince her otherwise. He simply said what he needed to say and let her decide what to do with the information. With children, conversations were more complex. Their relationship with him was based on an understanding of who he was, a financially generous but emotionally absent father. When Ricardo tried to share that he was working to change that, to develop genuine emotional capacity, they were cautiously interested but visibly skeptical. Years of emotional absence couldn't be undone by conversation. Ricardo began to appear differently in their lives, not dramatically, but consistently. He called not to check on achievements, but to ask how they were feeling about life. When his young grandson visited, Ricardo allowed himself to hug the child and feel genuine affection instead of efficiently performing the role of grandfather. When his daughter cried about a difficult divorce, Ricardo sat with her without trying to fix or advise, simply present with her pain. The changes were small, and the children didn't know what to do with them. There was understandable skepticism. But Ricardo continued consistently, not because he expected something in return, but because he finally had the capacity to offer genuine emotional presence and wanted to use it. Months turned into years. Ricardo didn't try to contact Anna beyond a brief email on her birthday, wishing her genuine happiness. She didn't reply, and he didn't expect her to. But he thought of her often with gratitude for having catalyzed an emergence of emotional capacity in him, even knowing he could never be with her. The irony that Jung would appreciate is that precisely what made Ricardo capable of genuine love, vulnerability to being hurt, was what ensured that love would be destroyed. A narcissist who doesn't feel can't truly be hurt by rejection because there's no genuine self to feel pain. But the transformed Ricardo, the Ricardo who finally experienced the devastation of losing Anna in ways that the old Ricardo never could. And that pain, though excruciating, was proof that the transformation had been real. Camilla eventually contacted Ricardo 18 months after their confrontation. She said she had observed changes in him from a distance through mutual acquaintances. She saw how he treated his children differently. She heard that he was consistently in therapy. And although she still carried scars from her time with him, she was beginning to believe that perhaps the transformation was genuine. She didn't offer forgiveness, but she offered recognition that he seemed to be doing real work. Ricardo appreciated the recognition but didn't ask for anything more. He didn't ask him to intercede with Anna. He didn't try to use Camilla's openness as validation to convince others. He simply accepted that some burned bridges would remain burned even after you stopped being incendiary. Anna also heard about Ricardo's changes through Camilla and others. She saw evidence of consistency over time, and part of her wondered if she had made a mistake. But another part, the part that had protected her, remembered that narcissists could maintain performances for years if the motivation was strong. And the decision to protect herself, even if Ricardo's transformation was genuine, had been valid and necessary. Ricardo occasionally considered seeking a romantic relationship with someone else, someone who didn't know his history. But each time he considered it, he felt it would be unfair. Any new person deserved to know about decades of narcissistic relationships he had conducted, and revelation would inevitably create the same doubt Anna had experienced. So Ricardo accepted that perhaps the capacity for genuine love he had developed would never be fully realized in a romantic relationship. But the capacity still existed, and he could express it in other ways. Through genuine presence with his children and grandchildren, through honest connections with friends he had begun to cultivate for the first time, through allowing himself to feel compassion for the suffering of others, even when it didn't benefit him. In a session with Enrique 3 years after meeting Anna, Ricardo reflected on his journey. He had spent 60 years empty, building an external empire, while his inner self was a desert. Then he had met Anna, who catalyzed the emergence of genuine emotional capacity. He had experienced true love for the first time, and he had lost precisely because the legacy of who he had been made it impossible for others to believe in transformation. Was it unfair? Enrique asked. Ricardo thought carefully. No, he eventually said. The consequences of 60 years operating from a vacuum were proportionate. People I hurt, they lived with the pain I caused. My living with the inability to prove transformation when I finally changed is justice, in a way. Painful, but fair. Enrique observed that Ricardo had developed something rare, acceptance of consequences without bitterness. This, he said, is a mark of genuine integration. You are not rationalizing or justifying the past. You are taking responsibility for it while still choosing to live differently now. Ricardo nodded. Anna destroyed the possibility of romantic love with me, he said, but she did it to protect herself, validly based on available evidence. I can't blame her for seeing the truth about who I was and not being able to risk believing that I've fundamentally changed. And paradoxically, the love I feel for her makes me want her to be protected, even if it's protected from me. This is an extraordinary development in Ricardo's psychological structure. He had evolved from a narcissist who didn't see others as having inner reality to a person capable of genuine love, who prioritized the well-being of others, even when it meant accepting his own solitude. The transformation was real, but reality couldn't be proven to those who needed proof before trusting. Anna never went back to Ricardo. She eventually found another partner, a widowed man with a verifiable history of healthy long-term relationships. When Ricardo heard through mutual acquaintances, he felt genuine pain, but also genuine joy for her. This mixture of emotions, pain for his own loss and joy for her well-being, was proof of love that transcended possession. He had loved her not for completing him, but for who she was. And he wanted her happiness, even if that happiness didn't include him. Camila witnessed Ricardo's transformation over 5 years. She saw consistency, she saw evidence of genuine change, and eventually she offered something Ricardo didn't expect: forgiveness. Not forgetting, not a complete restoration of trust, but recognition that the person he had been and the person he had become were fundamentally different. Ricardo received her forgiveness with gratitude, but also with humility. He didn't assume that Camilla's forgiveness meant that others should forgive him. He didn't use it as validation to prove to others that he had changed. He simply accepted it as a gift he didn't deserve, but for which he was grateful. The question that remains is whether Anna was right to distance herself, to protect herself based on Camilla's warning and her own inability to distinguish transformation from performance. Jung would say, there is no single answer. From a self-preservation standpoint, Anna made a valid choice. Protection against narcissistic potential is a legitimate responsibility to herself, but from the standpoint of possibility, she may have destroyed the chance to witness and participate in a rare, genuine transformation. The tragedy is that both perspectives are simultaneously true. Anna wasn't wrong to protect herself. Ricardo wasn't performing a transformation. And the result of two incompatible truths colliding was the destruction of genuine love that could have been meaningful to both of them. For Ricardo, work became living with the emotional capabilities he developed without a romantic relationship to complete them. He learned to find meaning in other forms of connection, grandfatherly love for grandchildren, deep friendships with people who didn't know his older self, compassion for strangers that he allowed himself to genuinely feel. And crucially, he developed the ability to sit with his own solitude without trying to fill it with achievements or distractions. Solitude was no longer emptiness. It was space where he could genuinely exist with himself. Sometimes this space was painful because it contained longing for Anna and recognition of wasted decades. But it was real, and reality, even when painful, was preferable to the numb emptiness that had been his existence for 60 years. The psychological lesson this configuration offers is profoundly complex. It shows that genuine transformation is possible even for a narcissist who has operated from a vacuum for decades. Ricardo proves that dissociated emotional capacities from childhood can be recovered in middle age if a person is willing to do the brutal work of confronting them. But it also shows that transformation, no matter how genuine, does not erase the consequences of decades of destructive operation. Hurt people have the right to protect themselves, even if it means rejecting genuine transformation from those who hurt them. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth, sometimes empaths destroy true love in narcissists not out of cruelty, but out of legitimate wisdom for self-preservation. Anna wasn't being vengeful, she was being wise based on available information. Camilla wasn't being obstructionist, she was protecting her friend based on lived experience. That their protection coincided with the destruction of Ricardo's fragile emotional capacity is a tragedy, not an injustice. Ricardo, at 68, now lives a radically different life than he did at 60. He passed his construction empire on to his children. He traded his large house for a smaller apartment. He dedicates his time to genuine relationships instead of professional transactions. And perhaps most significantly, he has developed the capacity for gratitude towards Anna, without resentment for having lost her. In conversations with Enrique, Ricardo occasionally expresses that Anna was the love of his life, even though he only knew her briefly. Not because she was perfect, or because a relationship would have been without challenges, but because her presence catalyzed the birth of his capacity to love genuinely. And although specific love for her cannot be realized, that capacity remains. It was a gift she gave without knowing she was giving it. Enrique observes that Ricardo has developed what Jung would call a differentiated self. He is no longer completely identified with the persona, nor with emptiness. He has integrated emotional capacities that he had previously dissociated. He has accepted responsibility for past harm without being crushed by guilt. And he has learned to live with the consequences of decades of narcissism while being a different person in the present. The key point of the title, when the narcissist realizes that the empath will destroy their true love, is not a moment of guilt or villainy. It is a moment of collision between equally valid imperatives. Self-protection versus the possibility of witnessing transformation. Wisdom based on past experience versus faith in the possibility of present change. There is no absolute right choice, only choices with different consequences. Anna chose protection and likely lived a safer life. Ricardo experienced the annihilation of genuine love, but continued developing emotional capabilities in other ways. Camilla protected her friend and eventually witnessed transformation through safe distance. They all pay different prices for different choices. The story doesn't offer a romantic redemption where Ricardo eventually proves himself to Anna and they live happily ever after. Because life rarely works that way. Genuine transformation doesn't guarantee reconciliation or second chances. Sometimes we fundamentally change and still live with the consequences of who we were before. That doesn't make the change any less real or less valuable, just less complete than we would like it to be. Ricardo carries Anna in his heart in a way he never carried anyone during 60 years of emptiness. Not out of obsession or possession, but out of gratitude for having shown that the capacity for genuine love still existed within him, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. And even if those conditions didn't allow love to fully blossom, the emergence itself was a transformation that no one can take away. And perhaps that's enough. Not ideal, not complete, but enough. A narcissist who finally experienced true love and lost it not because of performance, but because the legacy of performance made it impossible for others to believe in authenticity. An empath who wisely protected themselves but perhaps destroyed a rare opportunity to witness genuine transformation. And between them, love that was real but unachievable. Love that proved that even the emptiest psychic structures can be filled with genuine capacity if the right conditions arise, even if too late to repair all past damage or convince all those who witnessed emptiness that fulfillment is real.